Welcome. As part of India Today's new series, Jumpstart India, we've been speaking to top corporate voices to get a sense from them on what needs to be done to revive economic activity and bounce back from Corona coma. Today, I want to get a sense of the thinking within the Modi government. With every sector in precipitous decline, where does the government intend to deploy its limited financial resources? My guest today in this edition of Jumpstart is the Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, an internationally acclaimed economist and best-selling author. He spent 2 decades in the financial sector and was the global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank till he joined the Indian government. Sanjeev Sanyal, welcome to today's edition of Jumpstart India. The cries for help from Indian industry, Sanjeev, are getting louder and more desperate. Everyone is wondering, is the government listening and what does it intend to do? So let's start from there.
Well, it's not that we are unaware of the fact that there is a lot of disruption in the economy. I mean, clearly when you opt for something like a nationwide lockdown, those who imposed the lockdown clearly did it right up front, knowing that there were very serious economic costs to doing something like that. So it's not surprising that there is a lot of pressure on the business sector as a result of this. Now, having said that, let me say that we have taken a somewhat different approach to what maybe other countries have done. First of all, as Prime Minister has explained on numerous occasions, we prioritize the health emergency over the economic emergency to start with. This is not because we didn't recognize the problems with the economy, but because our view was that if we didn't get the health situation under control, given our population and the density of our cities, it would simply be go out of control, and then nothing else would matter. So that was our first priority. We went through the first 3 weeks lockdown. Since the 20th, as you know, we have been slowly unwinding it. Now we are going towards May 3rd. Perhaps if the data allows it, we will unwind further. So what we did is a lockdown, and then we prioritized the health pandemic over the economic.
So that I've understood, and we don't want to get into the necessity of the lockdown just at this moment. I want to focus on what can be done best to ventilate the Indian economy. Today is May Day, or International Labour Day, and the biggest concern, Sanjeev, is around job losses. There was a CII study that came which said that they asked CEOs, and 1/3 of them expected job losses between 15 to 30% in their respective sectors, which essentially means that amongst people who are watching, 1/3 of the jobs could be at risk. What's your government doing, sir, to ensure that you're able to mitigate the losses and minimize damage?
Again, our approach has been somewhat different from that of many other countries. Other countries may have gone for a large trillion-dollar package up front. Our approach has been different. Instead, what we have done is, in the beginning, we focused on some sort of a cushion to the system. So whether it's in terms of the Reserve Bank on repeatedly coming out and put liquidity out there, or the effort from the government side to going out there, physically putting some food out there, putting some money in the people's pockets through direct transfers and so on. Now, nobody is making the claim that that resolves the problem. It is purely a cushion. Now comes the next approach, which is that we have opted for a step-by-step calibrated approach towards trying to reopen this. And as we go through this, we will carry out several packages will be announced rather than one big one, and they will be slowly ramped up. First, through the opening, which we are already beginning to see, and then, of course, through the rebuilding, which is the next phase, which we haven't yet come to. Believe me, we understand the seriousness of the situation. We have resources, both fiscal and monetary, and, of course, the ability to do serious...
But there is a growing sense of frustration, Mr. Sanyal, about why it's taking so much of time. Many countries front-loaded their economic packages, and therefore, industries had a certain sense of comfort. In India, there is anxiety. The comfort is still lacking. What's taking so much time?
Because, as I said, we have taken a somewhat different approach, which is we are taking a feedback loop-based approach in which we will ramp things up step by step. So we are telling you up front that that is the approach we are taking. Why are we doing this? Because we are clearly in an environment where there are lots of unknown unknowns. So when we are in an evolving situation, rather than use up all our ammunition up front, which may work in other countries and other contexts, so I don't want to comment on their approach, but in our approach, what we have consciously taken the decision that we will do it, ramp it up over time.
So
Now,
what
this
I
is
want
not
to
because
do,
we are willing to do this,
Mr.
or
Sanyal,
not
is
have faith.
to show you some of the comments that were made by some of the key industry voices cutting across sectors when they came on India Today's Jumpstart India. I'll play out an excerpt. I'll then get you to respond to the voices that industry is raising, because it's important to listen to what they're saying and then see what the government view is. So I'll start with Puneet Chatwal. He's the CEO of Indian Hotels. They run the Taj Group of Hotels. He was on our show. Let's see what he is asking in terms of a moratorium and extending the period, and then we'll go back to Sanjeev. Let's listen to Puneet Chatwal.
Like we got a 3-month moratorium on principals, interest, on all other obligations. Maybe a 12-month moratorium is needed. Maybe, licenses get extended automatic because businesses cannot do anything if they are shut down, and you have to still pay the excise fees, you still have to pay property taxes, you still have to pay all other duties and obligations without having any revenue or use of the space. I think state governments can help in terms of giving electricity or other utilities at a marginalized cost or certain written reductions.
Okay, so you've given a 3-month moratorium, Mr. Sanyal. One industry voice, and many would echo this, asking for an extended 1-year-long moratorium on principal and interest obligations, saying industry is shut, our hotels are shut, how can we pay and meet our obligations? How do you respond? What do you think?
So clearly it is a very difficult time. Nobody is disputing that. And even the moratorium that was given is fully understood to be not a panacea, but merely a cushion to buy ourselves time while we begin to roll out this. These, as you can imagine, there is no point in simply throwing resources in general. And there may be certain areas where large amounts of resources, like, for example, keeping the financial system from gridlocking and seeing cascades of defaults. Clearly, we need to act there in scale and do it quickly. But the fact of the matter is, this is not a sprint. This is, at the very least, a middle distance run. It may even be a marathon for all we know. So we have to take feedback and begin to roll it out in step by step.
So now, can I build on that analogy that you're drawing? You're saying this is a marathon, not a sprint. I could say India Inc. looks at this as the patient being in ICU, they're desperately seeking help, they're thinking of the government as the doctor, and if the doctor is saying, oh, I've got time, the patient's worried he may die by the time you reach there, sir.
Well, this is precisely why we did do some quickly thing. That is precisely what those moratorium, like the 3-month moratorium, is about. It may be extended if necessary. Obviously, it's not for me to announce specific policies. That's the prerogative of the finance minister and the prime minister. But the fact is that we understand that this is a difficult time. It is not the case we don't understand that it's a difficult time. We also understand that these initial steps that were announced is not going to solve the problem. I mean, I'll be the first to say that. But you have to understand that we are willing to do a lot more, but we will do it in a calibrated fashion. So, for example, there is obviously, you have seen the Reserve Bank significantly cut interest rates. Now, clearly there is an issue with it feeding through the transmission mechanism. So we're going to have to fix that. So at every stage, we have to not simply announce a grand package. We have to make it work on the ground. That requires us to pay attention to the actual workings, the nitty-gritties of it, then make sure it works, get feedback on the fact that it works, and keep going, and so on and so forth. So a lot more will be done in stages. And by the way, it will happen a lot sooner rather than later.
I want to show you now what Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry, said, and this is a big demand being made. I don't know how it's possible, is it feasible? I'll ask you about that, but he's raising the point of GST and whether the government can stop taxing companies because production is down, demand is down. They're saying the one way the government can help is by doing away with GST for a while. Let's listen to Chandrajit Banerjee.
We need some extraordinary measures to tackle these extraordinary times. Say, for instance, GST. We have to have some way of doing away with it. There is no production anyway at this point in time. So there is the income from GST could be really looked at from the point of view by the government of saying that let us forego with it for some time and see to it that that itself helps in picking up of the demand, and wherein we can get production coming in, we can see more demand coming in, and therefore lesser job losses. So it's extremely important.
So if goods and services taxes are reduced or done away with, companies say they'll be able to reduce the price of products. That could potentially stimulate demand, but that could also mean that government revenues collapse. So how do you view, Mr. Sanyal, this suggestion from industry, and a very strong, passionately echoed suggestion that can we have no GST for at least the next 6 months?
Well, we speak to all these industrialists that you have interviewed, and we take their feedback very seriously, no doubt. And even this specific one, we will take seriously. As I said, it's not for me to react to any specific measure, which is it's not in my purview. But what I can say is that we take this feedback very seriously. Many of them are very passionately debated even within the government. But as I said, we will have to do it in a simply going out there and, for example, since you talked about GST, let's say we do remove GST from the hospitality industry, which was the previous gentleman who was there. Now, will it help the hospitality industry? Now, it's not obvious it will. I mean, how many people do you know who have stopped traveling and living in hotels because of GST right now? So clearly, this particular step would help one group, but it wouldn't help the other group who you just in the previous person you interviewed. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to be careful to understand that there is no one silver bullet here.
No, okay, so what are your ideas when it comes to stimulating demand? One of the biggest problems in trying to ventilate the Indian economy is how do you create demand? From the consumer's perspective, huge concerns over job loss, therefore they'll want to cut every single rupee of discretionary spending that they can. They'll only focus on essentials. Everything that can be postponed will be postponed, but unless those people start buying, there's no manufacturing that will happen because they'll be creating inventory and nobody will be buying that inventory. How do you think demand can be stimulated, Mr. Sanyal?
So you're absolutely right that there is obviously a major strain on demand. And it's not just domestic demand. There are serious issues as far as global demand is concerned. So even if we opened up all our industries and we are all ready, what will our export sectors will have a great deal of difficulty exporting this outside. So we appreciate that issue. And these are not easy problems to solve. But there is space, however, to do things. One of them being that of the many countries in the world, India, as it happens to be, has significant monetary space. A point I've made before as well. In a world where and in many countries that have zero or even negative interest rates, we have actually significantly high bring them down. We also have more fiscal space than many people give us credit for. Unlike many developed countries with very high debt to GDP ratios, our debt to GDP ratio is much more reasonable. So there is
no, but you haven't given. I just want to cut in because you haven't given me any ideas on the specific question that I asked about how do you see the challenge of reviving demand? What idea? I'm not even asking about what the government will announce. I'm saying, do you have any ideas about what can potentially be done about how to revive demand under the current circumstances?
Of course we do. We do have, and ultimately whatever those specific measures are, they will boil down to the following things. One, to what extent we are able to make the monetary impulse transmit. That's an important issue. The Reserve Bank and the Finance Ministry are very paying a lot of attention to that. As I said, we have more fiscal space than maybe we are given credit for, and we will use it. And of course, there is a lot of structural changes, structural measures that we can also do to make ourselves more efficient. But again, we have to take into account the constraints that are there, that we will be for a significant length of time in a world where there is very weak export demand. We have to take account of that. But there are positive things that we can also take advantage of. For example, energy and other commodity prices are likely to be quite weak for an extended period of time. Although, of course, predicting oil prices is not an easy thing. But nevertheless, I think it's a fair chance that it will be weak for a while. and so on and so forth. So I think there are areas. Other area can be use the opportunity to invest, ramp up investment in infrastructure, something that we always talk about doing. And in an environment where capital may be particularly cheap globally, we may be in a position to ramp up infrastructure as well. So.
And that's what the United States did during the Marshall Plan after the Great Depression, creating the public infrastructure, which also saw the US through over the next several decades. I want to show you now what Kulin Lalbhai, he's the executive director at Arvind Limited, one of India's largest textile and apparel companies. He's seeking salary support, which has been done by more advanced and developed countries. Is that applicable in the Indian context? Let's listen first to Kulin Lalbhai.
On survival, the most important thing that is required is liquidity. I think companies will need the most help upfront when their revenues are 10-20%. It's very, very critical that the support is given upfront, and maybe for the blue-collared workers, there could be some direct support on salary, some partial support on salary given by the government, especially for the stress sectors. After we are through the survival phase, I think in the recovery phase, I would add to what Venuji said, some sort of demand stimulus would definitely help. But I think in the next 3 to 4 months, in the survival phase, liquidity and some sort of employment support would go a very long way.
Salary support either directly to employees or to companies, which can further get funneled to employees. Now we do this for farmers. Industry is saying, since this is not a mess of our making, this is beyond any normal business circumstance, can the government, as has been done in the United States and in countries like Germany and Japan, provide salary support to at least the less well-off employees? Mr. Sanyal.
So clearly, I mean, maintaining jobs is an important issue. Every suggestion, including this one, is being discussed. And of course, the other issue he raised, which was of liquidity and monetary support through easier credit, guarantees, and so on. That too is an important issue. And by the way, it's not just about the big industry. The real big problem for this is really in the SMEs and the unorganized sector, where obviously job losses not only will happen in large scale, but in many ways very difficult to track where those losses are. So these are not simple things. So we take the issue of stimulating demand and making sure there's adequate functioning of the monetary transmission, both for payments as well as to stop something quite dangerous, which is a cascade of defaults. Once that begins to happen, financial sector jams up, it can be very difficult to revive these things. So
now you mentioned MSMEs. I want to build on that because it's a catch-22. Virtually every sector is deeply distressed. Everyone desperately seeking your help. If you bail out MSMEs, and there's been a lot of talk from our reporters about a 3 lakh crore rupee package being potentially in the works, especially for the medium and small size enterprises, the big companies say a lot of the MSMEs are dependent on the bigger companies to get their orders from, but if the big companies go under, it's not as if the MSMEs can survive. Financial space is limited, resources are scarce and tough to come by. What is your priority in the survival stage? What is your priority, Mr. Sanyal?
Well, obviously we are in an ecosystem where everybody depends on everybody else. So it's not like we have anything against the big companies. It's just that one of the issues of monetary transmission has been the difficulty of getting credit through to the MSME sector, because typically what happens is there is a rush by the financial systems to safety, in which case even viable MSMEs very often find it very difficult to get credit. So you have to provide some extra love and care for the MSME sector. They do employ a very large number of people, and since well, if there is a problem in that sector in terms of employment, it will ultimately feed back to demand for the products of big companies. So, it feeds in every direction. So a very important part here is to make sure that the chain and flow of cash, the cash flow of the economy, is maintained. That, of course, the big companies are an important part of that, no doubt about that. But the small companies have a real problem, because very often, even if you ease credit conditions, even if you ease interest rates, it simply does not feed through to this MSME sector. So that is why some extra love and care is very often needed for this sector.
Okay, so we've spoken of blue-collared workers. Let's for a moment deal with unorganized sector and the laborers. Now, it breaks my heart each time I see a laborer with all his belongings walking, marching back to his village. For farmers, we've got direct benefit transfers. These laborers before the pandemic were largely not rostered. You didn't have their bank account details handily available to be able to make income transfers happen. What are your plans now to ensure that the laborers get some kind of support?
Well, we do have some sort of direct transfer systems, and of course, back in the villages, there are already Manrega type.
No, I'm talking about people working in the urban pockets in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, and now having to walk back because they don't get any income support. Not the farmers who are in the villages, but the laborers who are working in our cities, sir.
No, so once they're back in their village system, of course, there are systems there like Manrega, etc. Now, that doesn't solve the wider problem. The wider problem is that we have a slowdown, and in fact, one of the problems that you will see with this migration is that in urban areas where if and when growth comes back, they are going to actually face skilled and unskilled labor. So this is something that will be that we will have to pay attention to. But ultimately, remember, the most important thing is in the medium run. Once we are past the initial phase of opening up, is to revive growth. Demand, go out there also, rebuild our economy for the new world we are emerging into. Remember, we are not only just going to reflate the pre-COVID world. We will be in a somewhat different environment in the post-COVID world. There will be all kinds of changes around the world, not just in India. Consumer behavior may have fundamentally shifted. Geopolitics may have shifted. Supply chains may be fundamentally shifting. And this new world will have its own problems and its own opportunities.
So we'll build with how India can capitalize on the new emerging post-pandemic world. But I have one more question on labor. Now we're seeing trains being arranged to take laborers back to their villages, which is good because they've been stuck unsavorily so in urban pockets. And on the other side, you're telling industry that you can start, especially in the non-hotspot areas, you can start construction activities and other industrial activities. And people are wondering, if you're sending all the workers back and you're telling us to restart work, how are those two things supposed to go hand in hand? Mr. Sanyal.
So obviously, nobody's forcing anybody to go back home. This depends at the local level. If an industry is coming back on stream, presumably they will talk to their labor and there will be some sort of a trade-off that will be made. Nobody is forcing labor to go back full scale, but clearly there is a need to allow this movement to happen because there are people who are stuck for a variety of reasons. There are tourists who are stuck, there are students who are stuck, there are temporary workers who had moved for different parts of the country. So this movement has to be allowed, and we are trying to do this as organized as we can, so that we don't end up, spreading the virus into areas where it hadn't yet reached.
Let's spend a moment talking about whether we can turn this crisis into an opportunity. The Prime Minister held a big meeting yesterday, said that companies and the country should brace for a scenario where manufacturing wants to move out of China, come into other parts of the world. What plans are you making so that India can capitalize on this opportunity?
So clearly, a world that is going through a reset is something that we can take advantage of. I think there are many things that we can say about this. One, of course, that these supply chains are now going to recalibrate very significantly. Some countries have gone out and actually announced packages for doing this. Now, that doesn't mean that this will recalibrate to exactly how it was, back to what it was in the pre-COVID days, in the sense that there will be changes. People may have certain views about repatriating certain key functions. There may be ideas about how to think about risk, for example. Nevertheless, I think there is a huge opportunity here that we can.
No, but that
participate.
opportunity, sir, has always been there. Between April 2018 and August 2019, there were 56 companies that relocated out of China, removed their production out of China, out of which only 3 came to India, 2 went to Indonesia, 26 went to Vietnam, 11 went to Taiwan, 8 to Thailand. That opportunity has been around for a long time. We've never missed an opportunity so far to let go of that opportunity. What makes you confident that this time things will be different?
The current situation is clearly at a different scale, where this distribution of global supply chains is clearly going to happen in a totally different scale from what it has happened before. And yes, you're absolutely right. This is an opportunity that we have to make it happen. And of course, the central government will play a role, but very important role.
Now, can I get more specific? How do you intend to make it happen? Because we've had the will, but we haven't seen it translate into action.
So many of the state governments, and I think we already have reports, for example, Uttar Pradesh state government has already announced a effort in this direction. We had last year radically lowered corporate tax rates, if you will remember, towards this similar end. We will simplify other taxes if necessary, other rules and regulations if necessary. This is no doubt that this is an opportunity, and in many ways it's for us to make it work. Let me assure you that we take this whole matter seriously, and you yourself said that the Prime Minister is taking high-level meetings precisely on this topic. So obviously we do take it seriously.
I want to show you now what Varun Khaitan, the director and founder of Urban Clap, the urban company, said about e-commerce and keeping startups alive, given the fact that funding is now tough to come by and their business models have been badly disrupted. What is it that the startup sector is hoping for? And then we'll get Sanjeev to respond to that.
The government should encourage e-commerce and home delivery of products as well as services.
Okay.
Because e-commerce overall reduces the number of contacts, enables distancing. One can ensure safety practices like masks, gloves, enforcement of containment zones. All of this is actually happening. And we can even ensure contactless services, contactless payments. So many advantages to e-commerce. I think e-commerce should be promoted, and even I would say the traditional industries should be encouraged to partner with e-commerce companies, even bringing the shops and stores to be doing home delivery, to be adopting technology as a means of creating a safe environment.
Mr. Sanyal, the government seems in a bind. In the first instance, you announced that even non-essentials could be home delivered by e-commerce companies, which is an eminently sensible idea because it's relatively safe, far safer than going to a market. Then you came under pressure from the Confederation of Traders. You backtracked, double quick, and now you've said neither will e-commerce work, and you're allowing some of those shops to reopen. What are your ideas about trying to push e-commerce given what we're dealing with right now?
I think e-commerce is a very important part of the overall ecosystem, but I think it would be wrong to think of it as being the only thing that will survive through this. We are not building a world for remaining in eternal lockdown. In fact, even during a lockdown, a very important part of sustaining our social structures through this has been our kirana shops, which are not e-commerce. So it is not as if the e-commerce is the be-all and end-all. So I wouldn't react to a particular industry viewpoint on this. We have to take a wider view. And, in the ecosystem that emerges, the e-commerce will certainly play a role. But I think it's unfair to say that somehow we should exclusively use e-commerce as the way forward. That's totally not, I think, the correct way to think about it. We will take a much wider view and allow for things to evolve in their own way.
Finally, what's the thinking within the government about the quantum of loss to the economy as a result of this lockdown? And what are your current growth prospects? Because the IMF said we'd go at about 1.9%. The likes of Arvind Subramaniam, Mr. Mayaram, all of them said that that's hugely overestimated. What's your sense of the total loss to the economy and the growth rate that you expect for this fiscal?
Obviously, it's an evolving situation and it's very difficult to. Now we do not know how long the tail of this unwind is. We don't know how things are evolving in the rest of the world, in our export markets. We have, there is of course, a possibility of a second wave in winter. There are many, many moving parts here. So I'm not spending my time trying to estimate exactly how much this loss is. And I'm quite sure both the IMF and all these other gentlemen will be revising their estimates through this. For my purposes, all that is necessary to know is that this is a very significant shock, which we take seriously. And let me assure viewers that we will do what it needs to get this economy going again.
Sanjeev Sanyal, I want to thank you for taking out time and sharing with us your thinking on how the government is viewing the current stimulus. Everyone's asking for more help. What can follow? You're saying it won't be one big bang package, but many small doses, and why the Indian approach is different from what we've seen elsewhere. At least you've put out your thinking. Now we leave it to viewers to decide what they make of the current approach and then debate that. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, for joining us on this edition of India Today's Jumpstart. Many thanks.